Hey, Renter Retires, it's Adam Schrader here with Zach Lemaster once again, and we are joined this time by Alex Haler with the company AirDNA. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about short-term rentals, which is not something we delve into a ton here, but people have seen short-term rentals on our website. People are, looking to expand maybe out of their long-term rentals and get into some short-term rentals. So tell us a little bit about AirDNA and how y'all work in the short-term rental market.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks again for having me. So AirDNA is a website that has been basically tracking data and analytics for every Airbnb and VRBO listing in the world since 2014. So we have a pretty rich data set on occupancy, average daily rates. We can tell with a pretty high degree of accuracy what a prospective property should generate as a short-term rental, how certain markets are doing, whether they're growing or contracting. So we just put data in the hands of our users so they can make the most informed decisions on short-term rentals, Airbnb and VRBO specifically.
Alex, I think that a lot of our audience and investors would be particularly interested to get more short-term rental data on how either their property may perform. Like, is that an option for them to use as a successful short-term rental in the market that they own it in? Or maybe based on their investment, use this to base their investment decision on which markets to look at. So I have a few questions for you, but for someone that just owns a property, can you explain like how this would be valuable to someone that owns a few investment properties? Is this data that they are going to kind of allow them to see, is there high demand for a short-term rental in this area? Are there potential rent comps they can look like? What is the information available to them to help them see if that property would be a viable short-term rental?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So our flagship product on MarketMinder is what we call the Rentalizer. And so you can type in any address in the world into the Rentalizer and populate the bedroom, bathroom, and occupancy count for that property. And it will give you a 12-month projection on what that property should generate as a short-term rental. It'll also give you the average daily rate for that property, as well as the occupancy.
Is that dynamic rates as well throughout?
Yeah, we have that information. And for the Rentalizer specifically, it's pulling in from very specific geolocated comps in your area. So if I typed in my address here where I'm at, and I said, this is a 3-bedroom, 3-bath in Joshua Tree, what could I generate as a short-term rental? It's actually going to take the address I give it, sort of pull a circle of all the similar size properties in my area, and give me a weighted average projection based off of that.
So with the pandemic, obviously people were very concerned about short-term rentals to begin with. And then we saw some markets come back pretty strong. Can you talk a little bit about what areas have done well and what areas have gotten hit hardest by what's happening and kind of what you're expecting to see, in the next year or two? Is that trend going to continue, do you think? Is everything going to kind of come back? Or what are y'all expecting in the market?
It's a really, really interesting question. It's been kind of fun to watch how the numbers have moved since that. So I was actually running a property management company when COVID hit, and it was, one of the, scariest times I've had professionally. We had 6 figures worth of reservations cancel virtually overnight. Government mandated that, we were supposed to shut down all the rentals. I was a real estate agent at the time as well. So you're to stop doing all showings.
Best of all worlds, huh?
Yeah. So it went from, I think February 2020 was our best month ever. And we were just tons of momentum. We were really excited about it. March 2020 hit and everything shut down. It became very scary. Now, fast forward just 2 or 3 months, by June, the short-term rental market was just absolutely booming in my market, which my primary space that I operated in was in the mountains in Colorado. And so to answer your question specifically, a lot of the destination markets close to national parks, mountains, lakes, beaches, they did extremely well during COVID. People, felt trapped in their apartments or homes. They got tired of working from home and seeing the same space and being in the same location 24/7. So we saw a lot of those destination markets just absolutely thrive during COVID. On the flip side, a lot of the urban environments where, mandates and regulations, whether they be, restaurant shutdowns, wearing masks in certain places, different COVID protocols, those areas got hit pretty hard. So fast forward to 2022, where we're at now, I think you're starting to see both of those revert back to pre-COVID levels, where we're seeing a lot of growth in urban areas. Those are starting to sort of pick back up and hit great occupancies. And a lot of those destination markets that just had a, banner time rental wise, obviously, everyone had their struggles during COVID, but rental wise, they did really, really well. I think are starting to slide back down to some of the more normal market conditions as far as seasonality and demand and overall bookings for the area.
Interesting. I'm going to ask you to draw a little bit more on your managerial experience in the short-term space. For someone that is a newer investor that's never owned a short-term rental or that has limited experience and they're looking to get into the short-term space, I mean, what advice can you give them to set themselves up for success in terms of identifying location? I mean, anything with the property specifically? I mean, does it have to be a really large house with multiple bedrooms and bathrooms? Can it be just a regular? Can you use, in the right location, just a regular 3-2, 3-3 or whatever, and transition it into an Airbnb or a short-term rental versus, just using it as a long-term rental?
Yeah, good question. A lot there. I would say that, the smallest place that I've short-term rented is a 330-foot studio.
Closet.
Yeah, so essentially a closet. I market it as a studio to just try to get a bit more bookings, and then all the way up to like a 10-bedroom, Victorian mansion from the 1800s, and anywhere in between. I think that there's going to be demand for all sorts of different types of properties. I think what's important for a new investor looking at this is, number one, how much time and energy do you have long-term rental? I mean, you're talking about furnishing a place, taking photos, doing pricing, managing calendars, potentially listing it on multiple different sites. You've got Airbnb, VRBO, Booking.com, etc. So it's identifying what sort of time you have to dedicate to this. You can of course outsource it to a property manager if that's what you want to do. Then it becomes a question of, do I want one of these lower cost tech enabled options, which are great for some people, or do I live out of state, or is this rental just too far away and I need a full service, higher cost option for it? I mean, there's a lot of considerations that go into that. And I think another pretty important component of it as well is, is this a place that you're actually, as an investor, going to want to spend even at least a little bit of time at? And I say that because I think that, a lot of the best short-term rentals are ones where their owners are personally invested in it. Maybe they stay there once or twice a year, but I mean, even things as little as, making sure the kitchen is really stocked out and conducive to cooking a nice meal, or, all the closets and cupboards have, extra throw blankets and extra toiletries. I mean, all those little things really add up and make the difference between a 4-star and a 5-star listing. So I think there's a lot of different things to consider when you're going to purchase a short-term rental. Is, how much time do you have to dedicate to it? Is it a place that you're going to want to sort of actively monitor and manage? Or is it, purely an investment where you want nothing to do with it? You want to hand it off to a property manager. Then once those considerations are met, and once you sort of have an overview of where you want to invest and how you want to invest, then you can sort of look at the data and figure out, okay, if I know I want a beach location in Florida, or I want a mountain location in Colorado, then you can start to look at the individual markets and the individual data to make the best decision there.
So if someone's getting into this in the first place and they want to be passive, what are some general numbers? Like we know with our company, kind of in general, what your maintenance is going to be, what your vacancy is going to be, what your management's going to be. But, it's a lot easier to figure that out on, long-term rentals than short-term. So what are some general numbers that you suggest people use for, vacancy management and those? I would assume maintenance is going to be roughly the same, but, for vacancy and management, what should people be plugging in as they're doing a rough estimate? Obviously, you don't know every single market, but roughly what would you recommend?
And I would argue maintenance is much higher probably in short-term rental just because you have people coming and going. But anyways, yeah, let's hear from you, Alex.
Yeah, the maintenance thing is kind of an interesting piece. I'll answer the first question, but to touch on that, when I first got into this, I was sort of under the notion that short-term rentals were going to be much harder on the property than long-term rentals. But I found kind of the opposite, because short-term rentals, they know that their credit card's on file. They know that you're going to write a review about them. You could charge a security deposit to them, and you have cleaners there once or twice a week, sort of cleaning the property and maintaining the property.
Interesting.
Whereas some long-term rentals, they could potentially let a leak under the sink fester for months to the point where it's no longer just, tightening some plumbing, it's replacing cabinets. So I think it can go both ways on the maintenance piece. To answer your question about property management costs, I've seen there are a couple sort of national booking behind the scenes engine only options that are as low as about 10%. But they don't really offer many on the ground services as far as, cleaning and maintenance goes. So that would be something you'd have to find and source separately. And then there are some full service property managers out there that charge as high as, 35, 40%. I've seen as high as 50%. It's about the highest I've seen. But I think a good weighted average across the nation for full service, you're probably looking at 20 to 25%, I would say is, a reasonable, attractive rate.
And then as far as like vacancies go and things that's kind of looking into the rental analysis of, what a typical occupancy time is based on dynamic rents. Obviously, a lot of these places have seasonality to them where the majority of the money may be made in a quarter of the year or something like that. So that's probably a variance where you can't just plug in a 5% vacancy. You really got to just look at the analysis. I know because we do sell short-term rentals from time to time. And when we do, we keep the vacancy at 0 because it's already factored into the rental estimates of, hey, this is what your estimate is if it's rented for 300 days a year at these dynamic rents. So just a little bit of a different analysis. This is probably very geographically dependent, but what would you say would be a good performance for occupancy time throughout the year for a typical vacation rental?
Does vary a lot from market to market. So for like a really, really good, well-run, say like 2-bedroom condo in the mountains in Colorado, you are probably doing really well if you're hitting somewhere between 60 and 70% for annual occupancy. And it's going to be really heavy during the ski season and during the summer. Whereas, spring when all the snow's melting and fall when it's, likely too cold to hike, but no snow to ski on, you're going to have really soft shoulders. And so the good occupancy there of 60 to 70% is probably going to look a lot different than an urban area like, Atlanta, Chicago, Denver. I would imagine most well-managed 2-bedroom condos in those markets, you're probably looking at more like 80 to 90% occupancy if you use dynamic pricing.
Sure. And then some locations that tend to have more draw year round. A lot of stuff that we do in Florida, especially if it's like Orlando, super high occupancy rates there, because year round it's attractive to travel. Kind of switching gears here. When would you say, or when have you seen, Alex, short-term rentals not be successful or fail?
When have they not been successful? I would say, I've seen it a couple of times in this sort of, high priced, hectic real estate market that we're in, where, a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot of, but I've talked to a few people who this seemed to, the short-term rental that they purchased seemed to have been a stretch for them financially. So maybe they, use too much leverage, have too high of a monthly cost based off of what the property is projected to do. And, I think a lot of people got caught up with, being, again, with COVID, stuck in their homes and wanting to have a place to escape to. So I would say, where you can run into trouble is just, and I'm sure you guys talk about this all the time on the podcast, but it's just making sure that you really understand your projected revenue, projected expenses, and then, build some vacancy and emergency costs and cushion in there to make sure that your investment's going to be okay. I think that in this real estate market that we're in, not everyone is fully considering that the way that they should. So I would say that's probably one of the bigger risks, is just spending too much or using too much leverage to acquire a property.
Yeah, definitely. My opinion would be, to your point, having additional reserves. There could be definitely potential more fluctuation for whatever reason. And being able to, don't make it an emotional decision. Absolutely, being in an area that you want to personally visit is great, but I would not recommend just buying it from an investment perspective. If, and it's hard sometimes with where price points are at, but to really, even break even on the property, but with your mortgage and expenses. But yeah, don't make it an emotional buy. Run the numbers, and if it makes sense, and if it's going to be positive cash flow and you have the reserve amounts, then it might make sense. What we've seen, and maybe you can speak to this, but with more people working from home or being able to work remotely, we have seen some locations that you typically wouldn't think about using it as a short-term rental, or it's kind of like a hybrid. Maybe you have people coming in and living in a market while they're waiting for housing, because we have this huge housing shortage, so maybe they're waiting for 3 to 6 months and they're renting out just on like kind of a short-term basis, or an area where people are traveling more. And we've seen a lot of investors in some of these random Midwestern markets that have actually been successful turning their regular long-term rental into short-term rental, and actually doing better in terms of the rental performance on it. And that's where something like your software and your guys' platform could be very useful, of just kind of an initial starting point, right? Is looking at comps. What other advice would you give to someone that already has an established long-term rental that's looking at, hey, what would the performance be if I wanted to explore doing a short-term rental? Obviously getting quotes from local managerial teams, starting with maybe an analysis with AirDNA. What other suggestions would you have for someone in that scenario?
Yeah, if you already have the property, and you have the use case, you have the town, you already have the long-term rental, using our software is going to be really cost effective. So, we charge, generally speaking, by either the city or the zip code. And so for certain people, they say, hey, I have no idea where I want to purchase the short-term rental. So maybe I need to purchase a statewide subscription or a nationwide subscription, which obviously costs more than, a zip code or city level. So if you already have the home and you wanted to, the Rentalizer tool that I mentioned earlier, where you can just type in an address, tell it the bedroom bathroom count, and it will give you a 12-month projection on what a property should generate. That's free to use as far as the sort of like the most important numbers that it will give you, 12-month revenue, average daily rate, and occupancy. So anyone can go there and just sort of get a baseline idea of what their property ought to generate.
And that's free, right, on the platform?
That part's free, yeah, absolutely. Then the paid version, which again ranges from $20 to $40 a month for really small markets where there aren't a ton of short-term rentals, up to $100 a month for a huge market that's got a ton of short-term rentals. The free version gives you sort of a general idea of what the property should generate, but it just doesn't include all the detail that frankly you'd probably want to take a look at if you were seriously considering making this decision. So I'll give you an example. My house here in Joshua Tree, if you put in my address into the Rentalizer and say it's a 3-bed, 3-bath with this address, it's going to show $122,000 per year on the Rentalizer. But then when I scroll down and look at all the actual comps for the property, some are doing close to $200,000 a year, and some are doing as low as $60,000 or $70,000 a year. And in my particular case, in my neighborhood, the only difference between those two properties are ones that have a pool and ones that don't. And so the comp set is something that we don't include in the freemium. Again, you get those top, most important 3 numbers. You just don't get the detail to sort of digest and sort of analyze those numbers, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So what is if I was just kind of think I'm looking for, a short-term rental property, what are some of the ones that perform best? Is it like a 3-bed, a 4-bed? Is it 2? Is there kind of a sweet spot of what to look for in terms of bed and bath combination for short terms?
I mean, pretty much all sizes of properties have their place. I would say the larger you go, generally speaking, the lower your occupancy is going to be. And the smaller you go, studio, 1 bedroom, even 2 bedroom, especially in more, urban and city environments, then the higher your occupancy is going to be. But that said, I mean, some of the bigger homes perform really, really well in certain destination markets and markets that have, different events. Coachella Valley, which is, maybe an hour away from me, a lot of the bigger homes do really, really well there because they're having all sorts of different music festivals, big live events. And so a lot of people will, gather with their friends and rent a 4 or 5 bedroom house. So the larger homes do really, really well out there. Whereas, if you have a studio or a 1 bedroom in a popular city where tourism's pretty much year round, then it's pretty much always going to have demand. So it really depends on the market. But I would say, for most markets, you can't really go wrong with a 2 or 3 bedroom.
What about insurance? And this maybe is something you may not be able to speak to, but typical homeowners insurance, is it more for a short-term rental? I mean, typically, do you require this is speaking more to your management side as well. Are you requiring the tenants to also have their insurance as well, or put a deposit down? Or
so for insurance, there's a few different areas on it. One is, do we need insurance for any incidental damage that the renters might do to the property? If they spill a glass of wine on a rug, or if they accidentally break the window, is there going to be some sort of incidental insurance to cover that? That's sort of one aspect that's becoming pretty popular in the short-term rental industry. For homeowners insurance, and like from a homeowner perspective, you would need to talk with your insurance company and make sure that you have some sort of short-term rental rider on the policy, just to make sure that, any sort of damages, a burst pipe, so something catastrophic to the house would be covered by short-term rentals. When I started doing this back in 2014, that was pretty rare. And honestly, like, a lot of insurance companies hadn't even heard of it and didn't offer it. And then the ones that did charged a ton for short-term rental riders. I think that's changing now, and it's getting much more normalized. And I think that there's a lot of different providers that will cover short-term rentals within their policies. And a lot of property managers will, have some sort of additional liability insurance. And then Airbnb and VRBO also have similar incidental damage policies that, they use to sort of assuage the fear of, something terrible happening to your house. Although I would recommend, insuring it on your own as a homeowner versus relying on a property manager or a third party like Airbnb or VRBO.
Yeah. Does AirDNA have any, do you recommend property managers in areas? Like, if you wanted to get the more detailed, does it give you this is the returns you can get, and these are some good property managers in the area? Or is that something that kind of people are going out and finding on their own?
Yeah, so we do have that on the overview tab of our Market Minder software. So if you type in a city, it will show you, how many listings there are, what the occupancy is, how those numbers are changing over time. And then we do have a box on that overview page of like the top, 4 or 5 property managers in a given area based off of reviews and number of listings. So we provide a bit of that context in there. There's also, all sorts of different resources out there and blog posts that not only we've done, but other players in the short-term rental space have done as well, that you can look at for it. But yeah, we do provide an overview for property managers on our software.
Excellent. So what is I know you talked a little bit about it, but if you were going to look at one spot to invest in, maybe not necessarily like a specific neighborhood, but is there one area where you've seen like kind of an explosion in short-term rentals that y'all are thinking is going to continue, for the next few years?
It's a really interesting question as we're coming down from the height of the pandemic. I would say that, the answer to this question just a couple of years ago is probably a lot different than it is today. I think that a lot of urban areas, mid-sized cities, just personally, the Midwest is pretty interesting to me right now. Reason being is I think a lot of the areas in the Midwest have a lot of, desirability and people will go to them, but a lot of them have not experienced the same massive surges in real estate costs that other markets in California, Colorado, and Florida have had. So I think that there's going to be a lot of interesting spaces in urban areas, Midwest specifically, and just a lot of those areas that didn't have, the big price pops that other places had during COVID.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. The website is airdna.co. Is there any thing you want to leave our listeners with, or anything about your company you want to promote before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I would say, if you're interested in learning more, we have just a ton of resources on our website. We have a really active blog with all sorts of different, best places to invest posts, how to get started. Again, a lot of the data on our site is completely free for people to use. And then, once you start to get a little more interested and a little bit more serious about it, we have pretty reasonably priced subscriptions for it. We have a really good customer support team, and we're available for questions. So we're more than happy to be a resource in your journey of exploring short-term rentals.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us once again. airdna.co. You can find Zach and myself at renttoretirement.com. That's renttoretirement.com. You can see the properties we have, which, as we mentioned, we definitely do have some short-term rentals in Alabama and in Florida specifically for the most part. But that's renttoretirement.com. Really appreciate you leaving us a review on whatever podcast platform you're using. If you have any questions, email us podcast@renttoretirement.com, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks for watching the Rent to Retirement YouTube channel. Check out some of our other videos, like this one, or this one here.